An Unlikely Hero, a story featuring characters from Abrakam's world of Faeria. Written by Jason Guy, narrated by Claudia Guy. Ella wiped her face and threw the dirty rag to the ground so hard it startled her grazing yak, Henry. Cheeks as red as her scarlet hair, Ella had a mind to walk right back into town to show that rat brigand just who he'd shoved in the mud. Unlike most of the prairie folk, Ella knew how to fight. Her uncle had trained her. She could... Henry protested. His small black eyes seemed to say, "Don't do something stupid." "Fine," Ella grumbled, noticing another patch of mud on her shirt, which, like her pants and hat, was made of yak's wool dyed black. Yak's wool made the comfiest clothes in the world, cool enough for a summer day and warm enough to guard King Magnus from the icy winds of the Miraval Mountains. It wasn't something you just dumped in the mud. Yeah, I know mud washes out of yak wool. Everything washes out of yak wool. Maybe Henry was right. Why risk your life for something a bucket of water and a towel can wash away? Mayor Lewis had decided it best to just pay the rats, and he was the strongest man Ella had ever known, aside from her dead uncle. Trying to forget what happened in town, she looked out over the prairie at green hills that swam in the morning fog. She loved this land as much as the yaks that grazed it. It was a land more beautiful than the sparkling blue waters of Lake Oberon to the east, or the mystifying depth of Runan's Glade to the north. It had been her people's land once. Now, the prairie folk of Mikos only worked the land. That's what it meant to be under the rats' protection. Henry moaned, pushing his overwhelming weight against her. "The grass is better over there, is it? Or just better to eat it next to her," Ella replied, motioning to a female yak. The yaks all looked the same to the untrained eye. Massive loaves of thick, white hair that hung in well-brushed sheets that obscured all of the creature's features except a pair of black horns. But Ella knew better. It was a yak's gait, the rhythm of it, that revealed its gender. And this female's staccato placement of hooves was driving Henry mad. He'd been courting her, or at least considering that he should court her, for weeks. Her name was Mia. Ella led her bashful yak to his desired patch of grass and grinned while he began a casual, grass-nibbling approach to mask his intentions. "Bad time for that, don't you think?" an old herder said, half shouting so his voice would carry the dozen meters that separated him from Ella. A wealthy man by herder standards, he had 30 yaks in his charge. He stood beside a young boy, the son of a farmer who kept these grasses up to the yak's standards. The boy, like any good steward of the prairie, wore a hat of straw to save him from the sun, and kept a reed of fresh grass in his mouth so that the yaks could see that it was good enough for him to eat. "Bad time for what?" Ella replied to the herder, walking over to him to pay respect to his age, and so they might carry on with conversing at a more reasonable volume. She tried to keep her spirits high as she approached this man, whose back was so arched it stood in line with the top of his bald head. He was a man who never in his life had many kind words to say, and who had now reached an age and status where he had plenty more to say than he had to do. "Breedin' dear, don't pretend you don't know my meanin'." "It's spring, sir. Shouldn't another yak be welcome in fields as green as these?" "The rats is in town for their taxes. You fixin' to pay what more I'll owe 'em for another head of yak?" "You think one of them can tell a yak is with child?" Ella asked incredulously. Deciphering that was even more difficult than distinguishing gender. "I think I already told you what I thought," he replied in a voice firmer than before. Ella huffed, knowing she was defeated. Before she left, she turned to the farm boy who still stood beside the old herder. "It wasn't always like this, you know. Prairie folk used to stand up for what was right." "Prairie folk used to get eaten by dune drakes and demons," the herder corrected. "Or gnats," the farm boy piped in, much to the approval of his elderly companion. "You do know that Shara killed dragons, right?" Ella replied. "Shara ain't really one of us. Just lived around here for a time. She had God in her blood, girl. Ran round with one of them old frog swords." "So what? We have..." Ella looked around. "The yaks!" "What do you think we'd do with them? Load 'em onto catapults and toss 'em?" The farm boy squeaked with laughter, but stopped immediately, blushing when Ella chastised him with a glare. "Henry can pull 3 wagons all by himself. Who's to say he can't stomp at a rat or two? Now, listen here, girl. You remember Jeffrey? He's the last farm boy that got some of that grandeur you got up in your mind. He went off to work for them Gabrians. The man turned down to look at the boy beside him in the eyes. I heard they used him as fodder for one of their phantasms. You don't? Quiet, girl. You think you're Shara? Go and prove it. Lift her sword or mind your manners. Or are you fixin' to make up stories like that uncle of yours? Uncle Ricardo didn't. Quiet, I said. And get that yak away from mine. Don't got no patience to ask you again. You hear me? Ella stomped over to Henry, who had just grazed his way close enough to catch the scent of his would-be yak princess. Time to go, Henry, she said, pushing him with both hands when he ignored her. Time to go, she leaned in to whisper. Tomorrow, okay? That geezer falls asleep more days than not. You probably weren't going to actually talk to her anyways. The promise of another date convinced Henry to move in the commanded direction, albeit very slowly. Ella followed, keeping her eyes fixed firmly away from the old herder. That yak turd must have made another pass at her by the way the farm boy was squealing. Behind and ahead, the horizons glowed red as Ella and Henry made their way back to the prairie town of Mikos. Only in one direction, however, did they feel the heat behind the light, for the setting sun behind them burned so far away, while the fires that consumed their village were less than a mile down the road. Hurry, Henry, Ella shouted, leaping onto Henry's back and burying both hands deep into her yak's white coat. To her surprise, Henry obeyed, carrying them with such haste that the wind whipped her red mane into a frenzy as wild as the fire before them. She had never ridden Henry before now, nor seen anyone else do the same with another yak. She would have been happy to just save her energy for the fight to come, but at this pace they were within the village borders before she even had a chance to doubt herself. Ella commanded Henry to the hovel left to her by her late Uncle Ricardo, and ran inside beneath the blazing straw roof that roared like thunder trapped in crescendo. Heat wicking the sweat from her forehead, she raced to gather her two most valued possessions. Runan's fang, an unbreakable sword with an edge as sharp as the edge of eternity, and the bark of Everlife, a shield that forever kept alive whoever stood behind it. Ricardo gained these treasures on his adventures with Shara and passed them on to her when fever claimed his life. She had kept them safe, trained with them in secret, and today, the crash of burning straw and snapping wooden support beams tossed Ella from her feet and burned her cheeks with sparks. She clawed across the dirt to reclaim her armaments, then, turning toward the exit, found a wall of fire blocking her path. Heat pressed searing pain against her from all angles. The air seemed solid now, a hot iron coffin choking down around her. Not like this! Ella slipped her sword into a slot behind her shield. She braced herself behind the heavy wooden shield and bolted toward what used to be the exit. She couldn't see a way out anymore. She couldn't see anything behind the blinding veil of white and orange heat. Only memory served her now, along with the courage to jump through what may have well been the devil plains themselves. Ella charged. Fire licked blisters along her ankles and shins, but the bark of Everlife kept its promise and saw her safe to the streets outside.
Ma!
Henry moaned, rushing to her side and smothering her entire face with his supper plate-sized pink tongue. Off, Ella commanded. Not now! Henry obeyed, scuffing his hooves against the dirt as a display of discontent. Stay! I need you to wait for me here. Henry protested, moving defensively toward her. Ella shoved him back with her shield and shouted her command once more. Stay here! When Henry obeyed, Ella turned from him, running down the street and shouting for the attention of a man bemoaning the fire that claimed his hovel. What happened? Ella asked. Them rats said we was cheap on last month's taxes, but Mayor Lewis said he won't gonna open the treasury no second time for no rat that can't count right. He took his shirt right off, threw it down right at them rats' feet. We shouldn't have opened the treasury the first time, Ella replied, unsheathing the sword from its slot behind her shield. Where are they now? Is that Ricardo's old sword? Where are they? Girl, you need to run to the woods. That's where the rest of us is going. Ricardo won't know hero. Just a crazy old man everyone loved too much to tell him the truth. Before Ella could reply, two rat brigands darted around the corner with dual daggers curved for slitting throats. Knives like those weren't made for breaking through a shield's defense, though. She would have an advantage if it were just one of them. But rats took no pride in fair fights. They reveled only in the spoils of victory. The first rat approached her, smirking and juggling her knives carelessly. The second circled around behind her. Drool oozed from his snout, blue energy from his eyes, blood of some prior victim from his blades. Runan's fang flashing with fiery reflections, Ella charged the female rat before the other could flank her. If she fell this one quickly, she could face the other on even terms. She led with her shield, waiting to catch the rat's first attack so she could push against the blow and strike back with her opponent off-balanced. This is how her uncle had trained her to fight. It was not how the encounter unraveled. Ella's shield was useless before the rat's agility. Too fast for Ella to respond, the brigand slipped inside of Ella's defenses, diverted Runan's fang with her first knife, and pressed her second blade against Ella's throat. "Your reward for disobedience," the rat whispered in Ella's ear, scraping its stinking whiskers across her face. "A gift of steel." The rat's eyes rolled back in ecstasy as her knife dug deeper into Ella's flesh, rewarding blood with vaporous blue energy. The energy welled out of the rat's eyes, rolling down her cheeks and over her snout where she breathed it like pipe smoke. Death was a delicacy to this one. The taking of Ella's life an act she would savor. "Not like this!" Ella bashed her forehead into the rat's, wiping away her opponent's euphoria and replacing it with stunned anger. Ella stumbled backward, momentarily free but quickly crowded by the male rat behind her. She swung Runan's fang around her in reckless arcs, the way an untrained child might. Fear choked thoughts away. She was running now, tripping over her feet, her sword and shield nothing but weight slowing her down. But she refused to drop them. By Shara's blade, she would never do that. The female rat, eyes still blue from the taste of blood, tossed a grappling hook around a wooden arc in the town square and used it to swing in front of her prey. Ella tripped over her heels trying to escape and landed against a patch of something warm and soft. Henry? No, it wasn't Henry. It was some other yak. Ella recognized the rhythm of her hooves as the yak postured itself against the two pursuing rats. This was Henry's dream yak, Mia. Ella cowered behind her, now more a child than the hero she charged down here thinking she would be. The rat and her bloodthirsty companion descended on Mia in unison. A lone yak wouldn't survive against two rats at the same time. Ella knew this, but her arms were rubber, shaking, worthless rubber. How was she supposed to fight when she could hardly stand? Ella watched as 4 hungry blades plunged into Mia's hide, pulling out with gouts of blood rushing after them. Mia wailed as she gorged the male rat in the stomach with one of her horns, twisting violently to open the puncture into a gruesome cavern. The rat hardly responded to this wound, still digging knives into the yak, still drooling from the pleasure of the blue vapor. Even when physiology took over and his arms went dead and limp, he still seemed content. Lifting her trophy from the ground and tossing him to the side, Mia turned to face her second opponent. She likely never saw her, though. A blade already slipped across her jugular, turning her once white mane as red as the windstorm merchant's cowls. The female rat cackled with glee as the yak tumbled over and exposed the frightened girl still standing behind it. Ella resumed running, but this time with purpose. Running back to Ricardo's burning hut, she flung herself on top of Henry. "Run!" she yelled. Without delay, her yak bayed, charging with the same incredible speed that brought them here before. The rats, with all their nimbleness and grappling hooks, could not follow them onto the open prairie. After a few minutes, Ella saw over her shoulder that even the most dedicated rats pursuing them now leaned on their knees panting. Still, she gave Henry another few moments of charging before she commanded him to slow. Together, they turned to witness the village they both loved turn to embers. Henry took a few steps back toward the place they had just fled, huffing in panicked bouts. "It's not safe," she warned. "We have to go to the woods." He took another step, and Ella realized he must have been concerned for his beloved Mia. He wanted to go back. He wanted to protect her. "She got out," Ella lied. "She's going to Runan's glade like the rest of us." The words seemed to stay inside her as she spoke them. curdling in her guts like milk in vinegar. It was the right thing to lie to him, though. If he knew the rats had murdered her, he might act as foolishly as she had and charge back into town seeking vengeance. She wouldn't lose him today, even if it meant she had to feel this way, even if it meant he'd hate her for it later. Runan's glade was the safest place to hide from the rats because it was the most dangerous place to go on any other occasion. The rats preferred to bully those who could not defend themselves, and the beasts of the forest were far from that. Ella walked with a steady pace, hoping to exude confidence for Henry's sake, but often bumped into branches or tripped over roots. The moon had done an excellent job of leading her north through the prairie, but it did little to illuminate the world beneath this tangled canopy. On her most recent tumble, Ella felt something with more than several legs scurry out from under her hand. She shivered as she picked herself back up, thinking back to her uncle's tales of creatures that lurked in the woods, specifically the Verduran forces. Those spirits moved through the trees and became an amalgamation of whatever branches and twigs their ethereal forms happened to be passing through at the moment. Even if she were strong, she wouldn't begin to know how to protect herself from something like that. Her only chance, like the rest of the prairie folk, was to reach a tiki village and ask for asylum. She needed to find them first, though, before whatever made that slathering sound came out from the dark woods around her. Henry let loose a low growl as the beast stalked closer. "What are you, a dog now? Quiet!" Ella shout whispered. It may have been bad advice, but her gut told her that their best chance of survival was to stay quiet and hope the creature got distracted by a tastier meal. Everyone knew that yaks were better for wool than steaks, right? Snapping branches and escalating snarls said otherwise. Ella unsheathed Runan's fang and shielded Henry with her body. Before her, trees and branches shattered with angry rhythms. When Ella imagined her uncle's forest spirit, her heart pulsed ice into her veins. A hand bearing 3 slender fingers reached out of the brush and tore a sapling from its roots to make way for its bulbous body. Spidery appendages carried the creature's abdomen forward, a sack of flesh that glowed orange and exposed the tormented spirits within. But these ghouls were far too corporeal for their namesake, slimy, wailing sacks that twisted and slipped over one another. Above this radiant slug was the creature's jawless, gaping maw from which escaped a serpentine tongue. Above this watched 2 ember orange eyes. Ella gripped the hilt of her blade and tried to quiet its rattling against the back of her shield. Then the creature moaned with a terrible, aching tenor, a voice of hunger. Ella pushed back against Henry. "Run!" she yelled. The aberration clawed one hand into the earth to lurch its mass forward while swiping at Ella and Henry with the other. Ella stood her ground and swung her blade with the strength of a yak, cutting through bone like a plow through earth. Adrenaline flashed through her, steadying her feet, turning her sword lighter in her grip. Too light. Ella looked down at her hand and saw a hilt attached to a stub of metal, rusted along its jagged edge and dripping with sizzling acid. Ricardo's unbreakable blade had failed her. She dropped it to the ground, and her adrenaline seemed to leach back out of her limbs and tie a noose around her throat. The creature withdrew its injured hand and let loose another moan. It shook Ella at her core. Henry whimpered, terrified. "Henry, run!" She smacked him on the haunches with an empty palm. He didn't budge. Frustrated, she smacked him again and heaved her shoulder into him. She wouldn't stand by and watch another yak die. Not Henry. Please. Too late. The monster lurched forward a second time, this time keeping its spindly fingers at a safe distance. It wasn't going to grab them. Stretching its mouth out to cavernous proportions, it threw its entire mass at them. It was going to swallow the 2 of them alive. Holding her shield ahead of her, Ella charged forward, bracing against the foul miasma that was the beast's breath. If Henry wouldn't run, maybe she could draw the creature away from him. But before the creature could swallow her, something reached out of the woods. No, the woods themselves reached out and slammed the slug-like aberration to the ground. Ella skid to a stop as the forest creaked and twisted around a glowing emerald heart. 30 feet tall, the behemoth stood, a verduran force. The forest giant pounded the monster relentlessly with 2 wooden hands, causing it to vomit up tormented spirits it held within. They slithered out in 2s and 3s, becoming ephemeral wisps of green light as they touched the night air. Eventually, the verduran pulled its blood-covered bludgeon away from the dead, lightless corpse of the aberration. The verduran did not roar triumphant in its victory. It made no sound at all, nor did it pay Ella or Henry a single glance. It simply returned the foliage that formed its body back to their original positions in the woods and faded out of view. When its emerald heart lost its light, the 2 frightened prairielanders were again alone in the dark. "Henry?" Ella whispered, stumbling back in the direction of her yak. "Are you okay?" He whimpered. Tears streaming down her cheeks, Ella threw her arms around Henry, holding him close as his warm, thumping chest rocked the fear from her bones. "Your tears and salt," a small voice whispered into Ella's ear. Ella spun around to find a toddler before her with skin colored the deepest midnight green. Both arms rested lazily over an ornately carved wooden pole that lay behind his neck across both of his shoulders. Glowing green orbs lit the air around him, swaying like wind chimes disturbed by a gentle breeze. So startled, Ella could not find words to respond before the little one continued to chastise her. "A great one rescues. Your face should glow with life given." "I am thankful," she replied, careful with her words, realizing that this was no child but an adult Tiki. None of her uncle's stories could have prepared her for just how small he'd be. Yet he was her only hope for safety in the forest. She would treat him with the utmost respect. "I cried because I was afraid." "And now lie to me." "You don't understand." "And interrupt me?" Ella opened her mouth, then shut it right away, waiting the awkward length of silent time it apparently took for a Tiki to finish having his turn at speaking. "And ignore me?" "I was trying not to interrupt you," Ella huffed. "I wasn't lying before. I was being sincere." "Pretend fear, but Ophi watched you cut Sagami monster. Ophi will not be lied to by dead-skinned girl." While the Tiki reached down, rummaging for something in the forest litter, Ella looked between her pale skin and the Tiki's deep green. To a woodlander, green was the color of life. Her people, all the shades of earth and stone, must have seemed dead to him. The Tiki stood back up, holding Ella's discarded and broken sword. "You cry because Great Spirit did not also rescue Precious Weapon." "I would never lie to you." Ella spoke with her palms pressed together, as if praying the Tiki would believe her. "And I would never cry over a piece of junk like that." That was the truth. Only anger would help her cope with the lies her uncle wove of that common iron blade. Ophi looked her over a moment, narrowing his eyes with anger. "Runan's fang very sharp. Dead-skinned girl is dull." Ella looked at the hilt in wonder. It was really Runan's fang? "I thought—" "You speaking big and knowing little. Runan ever living. Many bodies, many fangs. Weapon only as strong as your blessing from her spirit." "But my uncle told me it was blessed." "Not it!" He took the long wooden pole from his shoulders and pointed it at her. "You!" He shook his head angrily. "Uncle more rude than niece to think blessing a thing to be given away. Ophi was to bless you, greatest warrior of dead-skin yak servants, but you not deserving Runan's guidance." Ophi scowled at her, still shaking his head, and then blew a silky tone through his wooden rod, which turned out to be an enormous flute. Additional green orbs lit the woods ahead of her, reaching into the forest in a long, meandering pathway. "Go, Deadskin. Follow Tiki Wisp to other yak servants. No harm to you in woods, but never you get Tiki blessing." Distracted by the strange glowing pathway, Ella turned back to further plead with Ophi, but he was already gone. His final words sank into her gut like cold stones. A Tiki blessing may have given her hope to stand up against the rats. Sensing Ella's dismay, Henry brushed his broad shoulder against her. She flinched away from him. "I'm fine," she said, annoyed. "We're safe now, right? Everything's fine. Her tone upset him. She should probably apologize, but she couldn't find the energy to say sorry to anyone anymore. Head sunken low, Ella started down the green-lit path towards safety. No more than 3 steps along her way, she stumbled upon a wooden mask. Its carving so precise she would have thought it the face of a living creature had she not now held the hollow thing in her hand. Strangely, it was far heavier than wood, as if reinforced by iron, though she knew the tiki would never craft with metal. Nevertheless, she resolved to return the artifact to Ophi. He may never bless her, but he may at least look upon her without that dreadful scowl. Ella unclasped her belt and drew it through one of the mask's eye sockets so that it hung from her waist. There, it burned cold against her thigh for the rest of her journey, somehow keeping a temperature much lower than the humid surroundings. The dawn exposed the tiki village for far more than the square of dirt Ella had noticed before passing out on it the night before. Nothing in the village seemed to have been built by axe or hammer, but rather grown, as if the tiki simply petitioned the forest spirits for what they wanted and waited for that thing to come alive before them. The carvings on Ophi's flute and mask were therefore very strange to Ella, and she wondered how they came to be when cutting or shaping dead wood seemed to be a foreign custom to the tiki. Currently, Ella lay cozied up to her sleeping yak, waiting for those with power to make decisions on the future for the people of Mykos. There was much talk by the tikis about whether the dead skins could find some other prairie to serve the yaks, or if they might be happier staying in the forest as servants to the tiki instead. Mayor Lewis did not very much like the latter suggestion, and he may have removed his shirt a second time had he not been so badly burned the day prior. None of this mattered much to Ella. The only decision she had made since entering the village was which of the leaf-woven mats to take from the tiki caretakers. Ella had asked a caretaker where she might find Ophi, but he had called her rude for asking an audience with their leader when they were all so busy helping the prairie folk. So, Ella just kept the mask, pondering over its carvings to pass the time. From her hand, it seemed to beckon her to place the wood against her face. That, of course, she would not do. Wearing a ceremonial mask was certainly not a respectful thing for an outsider to do. "Lazy, rat-loving, sabotaging runt!" The old herder's voice grew louder with each insult. The 3 thumps of 2 feet and a cane heralded his approach. "I'm really not in the mood for you," Ella replied, turning away from his voice and leaning her head deeper into Henry's fur. Henry started a low growl. She'd have to break him of that habit sometime later, when she didn't feel like growling herself. "Don't expect it matters much what you're in the mood for," the herder continued, now standing right next to her and prodding her in the rib cage with his cane. "I seen what you did with my Mia, and I'm here for what's owed." Ella shot up at the sound of the very beautiful and very dead yak's name. Henry quieted and turned to her with a look of confusion. "Didn't think I knowed it, did ya?" Ella looked at Henry, eyes wide with terror. "I was trying to protect you." "Don't try to spin no tales to me, girl. I seen what you done. Walked the rats right up to my Mia and watched 'em cut her up. Tell me it ain't true. Go ahead, girl. I want to see you try." Henry stood, leaving Ella to flop unsupported onto the woven mat. He huffed, panicked and angry. "The rats got to her, but it wasn't like he said it was, I promise. I was going to tell you, I warned you, girl," the man interrupted, swinging his cane at Ella's cheek. Ella ducked the blow and he stumbled, landing on already bad knees and spitting out a dozen gibberish-sounding curses. "Henry, don't!" Ella shouted, jumping to shield the old man from an angry yak she assumed was rushing to her defense. That is, until she turned to face Henry and saw more anger directed at her in that droopy face than should have ever been possible. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, tears leaking down her cheeks in pitiful streams. "I was trying to protect you." Henry scraped one hoof against the ground. He was angry, like he wanted to break something, and he was looking right at her. "Henry!" Ella continued to sob. "Please!" Henry huffed again and then turned around abruptly to charge off into the woods, snapping large branches like twigs as he ran. Ella stumbled after him, shouting his name as loud as her mucus-laden voice could manage, but her yak made no indication of heeding her call. "Don't you try and run from me, girl! Shut up!" Ella shouted at him, kicking the ground so hard it hurt her big toe. "Yaks ain't cheap. I'm here for what the owed, girl. What's there to take? I don't have anything left." This seemed to perplex the old man, as he didn't have anything to reply with, at least not right away. Ella didn't wait around for long. She was already on her way after Henry. The path of carnage he left behind was so obvious a trail that even a rude, dead-skinned yak servant like her could follow it. As the sun crossed its daily pinnacle, Ella discovered just how much hotter the woods were in the day than the prairie was. Without a breeze, her shirt and pants clung with sweat against her skin, and her long, red hair dangled in dripping clumps. Still, Ella refused to slow down. The path was long ahead of her, and she hadn't heard Henry's hooves for hours. The mask against her hip, still as cool as when she first picked it up, beckoned her to press it against the side of her neck. She did this and sighed as the cold leached into her blood and rushed down to chill the rest of her body. "Champion, sword, and shield." Ella spun around, bracing herself to face whatever creature just whispered in her ear. She found nothing but broken branches she'd just passed over. "Your strength does not yet match your destiny." Ella turned again. The voice, 1,000 whispering snakes, seemed as though it came from just over her shoulder. But no matter where she looked, she only saw sun-baked forest around her. "I can help you. I can." The voice halted as soon as Ella removed the mask from her neck. She looked down at it, considered tossing the cursed thing into the woods and continuing her pursuit of Henry, but then a sensation passed from the mask into her fingertips. It felt like adrenaline at first, a wave of heat that relaxed the aches from her legs and sharpened her senses. Then that heat began to burn within her, bulging every muscle like ripening fruit until they were taut and sweet with energy. Tentatively, Ella raised the mask to press it back against her neck. "The decured power is undeserved. They are weak. They are not like us." "Who are you?" Ella asked, forcing a firm voice through her state of total bliss. "We have no name. We are the strength of many, the legacy of power taken by those deserving. We are you for a time, then you are us. Sagami." Ella removed the mask from her skin once more. She had but to place it on her face, and its strength would be hers to keep. Another wave of energy pulsed up her wrist, flooding her veins with temptation. The sweet energy seemed even to reach into her thoughts, pulling memories across her mind like paintings left in the rain. With power, she could have defeated the rats. With power, we could have protected Mia. With power, we would never have to listen to that old man's blasphemies again. With power, Ella tried to throw the mask onto the ground, but her grip wouldn't open when she asked it to. Her other hand drifted over and grasped the mask as well. She turned it over so its shimmering, hollow inside faced towards her. White energy ran up both arms, and her veins turned ghoulish white. The power, just a taste of all the mask contained, was enough to snap steel in her hands. More than anything, she wanted to wield that power, to use it for what needed doing. And so she did. Hands gripping either side of the cursed Sagami mask, now mere inches from her face, she flexed her arms. Every ounce of spiritual energy the mask tempted her with, she poured into this one task, bending the heavy wooden steel until a glinting crack started down the center and the mask shattered into 1,000 pieces. A nova of blinding white energy shook the forest and Ella alike. When Ella awoke, she lay face up in the dirt, a small green face peering down at her with a toothy grin. Rude girl make sleep, but waking as hero of deadskin yak servants, passer of Ophi's test. Ella stared up in silent befuddlement at the grinning little tiki chief. You defeat soul-bound Sagami, evil wizard that binding dead spirits where not belong. This great service to Tiki. Soulbound Sagama what? Ella replied, still trying to rub the sleep out of her eyes. Evil Sagami wizard from before. How you no remember? Him losing mask making himself into ugly slug demon. Ophi made a face and stuck out his tongue in an effort to make his face look like the moaning creature that had attacked Ella in the woods before the Verduran force saved her. But you not being tempted and breaking mask. Now you receiving Ophi blessing. This better blessing than Sagami. Living blessing of Runan's spirit. Grows stronger when girl pass more test. More tests? These Runan tests. She show you, maybe. He shook his head and pulled his enormous flute around to his mouth. You not asking Ophi this. You get Ophi blessing now. Ophi blew hard on his flute, and a shimmering green mist came out from the other end. It wrapped around Ella and filled her with a deep well of cool, living energy. No music played for Ella's ears, of course, because the song was a thing meant for Runan's ears, and wolves, much like dogs, hear songs in higher notes than people of the prairie. Ella reached into the well of energy now within her, testing its depths to learn how powerful she had just become. She found no limit there, only a new understanding that it would never be the well that limited her capabilities, but rather her own strength of spirit. Thank you, she said to Ophi. Truly this is a blessing beyond measure, but I must leave you now. Henry ran away. I'm afraid he isn't safe. Turning to show Ophi the path of broken branches, Ella saw a barn-sized bear breathing green vapors out of his massive snout. His eyes, too, were green, but not emerald and full of life. They were a vibrant, burning green, rich with the hunger a predator shows its prey. What's that? Ella stuttered, stepping back and readying her legs to run. Possessed Ursa for girl if no passing test, and wearing Sagami mask instead of breaking it. Very strong Ursa. Made very angry by special Tiki blessing. Kill girl and give mask to Ophi so Ophi can destroy it. Oh, she replied. Ophi pulled down on one of his ears, his face knotted up in thought. A moment later, a big smile spread across his face. Perhaps you fill yaks with fury too. No offense, but I don't think that's okay to do with yaks. They're too Ophi understand. Even hero of yak servants afraid to anger fluffy masters. I should really go. Wait, before you go, one more thing you take. Ophi said, handing Ella her broken sword. This confused Ella until she took the hilt and watched as blue and green light grew the blade back from its rusted stub. This light, she knew, came from her chest, from the same well of energy Ophi just blessed her with. Runan's fang living thing, like Ophi blessing. I guess I shouldn't have left the bark of Everlife, Ella said, absent-mindedly remembering she had left her shield back in the village. Quiet again with rude words. No bark of tree ever living, Ophi scolded, speaking the last word like it tasted sour on his tongue. Only Runan eternal. Shield nothing special. Ophi blew a simple tune on his flute, and a wooden disc popped out from a nearby tree. A handle sprouted like a vine out from the convex side. There! Now hero have shield. It not very good. Ophi make you new one if it break. Or maybe hero find better someplace, not in Tiki Forest. He shrugged at her after that, and another note on his flute turned him into wisps of light that shimmered and dispersed into the trees above. Henry's path ended at the edge of the woods, facing the rolling prairies that led right to Mikos. This was particularly concerning to Ella because Henry remained hidden to her. This led her to conclude that her original act to hide Mia's fate from him had been wise, and that her most beloved friend had indeed stormed back into town to sow vengeance on the rats that killed his unrequited love. With the pulse of Runan's light beating in her chest, Ella drew her blessed fang and raced down the hills to rescue her friend. She ran as fast as the most esteemed prairie sprinter's legs had ever carried him, only without tiring over the long distance. She kept this pace, and though it was not nearly as swift as Henry's charge, she found herself among the charred remains of Mikos in a matter of tens of minutes. There she found the confident smirk of the she-rat who had nearly killed her the previous day. Strangely, the brigand remained silent with regards to the prairie girl's arrival. Ella understood the truth from her opponent's hungry, blue eyes. This rat had been denied her prey once before, and she wouldn't have some other rat taking it from her today. Ella turned her blade round in her hand and loosened her shoulder. Today she would not fight with rote patterns. She was of Runin now, the feral instincts of the wild her guide in combat, a threatened brother the source of her ferocity. The rat came after her just as she had done before, a ribbon of unpredictable movements. Her dual blades flashed like twin fires, flickering in and out of Ella's defenses, testing, teasing, feinting. But this jester's dance did not frighten Ella. With Runin's guiding strength, she knew better. Real combat was a thing of brutality. It was the weight of her shield crashing against the rat's chest, and the choking sound of air fleeing her lungs. It was the howl of steel rushing through the air until it cleaved red life from the one who threatens your family. Real combat left the heart-pounding glory through Ella's veins. Panting, vision swimming from the heat of her first kill, Ella turned to see where Henry might have gone. Instead of him, however, all around her she only saw rats gathered in packs of tens, surrounding her in a horde that numbered more than 100. Runin's fang was hungry, but not this hungry. Ella went on the defensive, keeping her left side protected with Ophi's wooden shield and making her right side so deadly a place that the rats had difficulty approaching her. She felled 3 rats quickly, dislodging the limbs of 2 and opening a huge gash across the chest of a third. But she felt their stings as well and watched the blue bliss leaking from their eyes when their knives tasted her blood. Runin's blessing made her wounds seal into scabs much faster than would have happened naturally. But she was no god like Runin herself. Some blood was lost with every cut. Her sight began to darken before she even slew a dozen of her enemies. A particularly deep cut across the back of her thigh sent her down to her knees. Dropping her shield, she found her neck precariously close to 7 hungry rat knives, and those were just the ones she could count. The rats were too many. She was going to die. She hadn't even found Henry yet. Henry had found her. Contrary to her expectations, however, he didn't seem to have ever been in need of her rescuing. He charged toward her at full speed, swaying his 2 horns in a smooth pendulum motion like a trained beast of war, tossing rats to the left and right. Without Henry having to come to a full halt, Ella threw herself onto his back. Much like they had the day before, the 2 charged away from the rats too fast for them to follow. Different, though, was what awaited them in the fields beyond. A herd of yaks, dozens upon dozens, gathered by the enraged Henry. And yet the yaks had not followed him into town to rescue her. They had stayed in the hills. They were afraid. The people of Mikos had followed them here as well. They hovered near the edge of the forest, shouting reason to their precious yaks, begging them to return to the safety of the woods. Even the oldest herder had made the journey. He scowled at Ella and made some insignificant comment that she ignored entirely. With Ella mounted high upon his back, Henry circled round the herd, huffing his anger and throwing dust up with his hooves. "Heed my words, yaks of Mikos," Ella boomed, her voice empowered by Runin's blessing, deep and fearsome as the growl of she who is relentless. "Today a dark god has brought a cancer upon our land. Rats who live to fight and burn and destroy all things we nurture and grow. The rats are cowards. See Henry's horns still wet with their blood?" Henry lowered his head, and the life of their enemies dripped down for all of the yaks to see. "Today let us show them prairie power. Today let us meet their transgressions with an avalanche of hoof and horn." Henry and the other yaks, unwilling to wait any longer for their herder's words, charged forward, the sound of their hooves enough to shake the earth and send birds flocking out of surrounding trees. "Make haste, angry yaks, and let us clean this cancer of rat and fire from our lands." And the yaks did just that. Like a wave from Beru's own fist, they crashed against the rats and broke their ranks into a scattering, fleeing mess. The rats that weren't impaled or trampled dropped their weapons and ran. And of the small numbers that survived the yaks' initial charge, many are said to have run so long and so fearfully that their lungs could no longer keep life within them. Only a very small few, no more than the number of pebbles you might keep within a closed fist, survived to tell the tale of their fallen brethren. And it is by those tales that no band of brigands ever set their eyes upon the fertile plains of Mykos ever again. And now you have heard the first story of Ella, the unlikely hero, and her indomitable steed, Henry. There were many more before their final rest, of course. Indeed, she would become more famed than Shera herself, but those are tales of another time, and such stories should never be told in tandem should they make the listener think any one tale less grand than the other.